So, Jumanji, the next level. Now, Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle from 2017 was a big surprise. I mean, it reformatted Jumanji from being a board game into being a video game that sucked players into the game, which is great because he had sort of this he had sort of like a body switch thing going on. He had a different format, and it felt like completely fresh and different from the past Jumanji game, and it had a very witty edge to it as well. So now we return once again to Jumanji: The Next Level, and once more we're back in the game with a lot of the same cast and characters, and for the most part, I think there's just enough here to warrant coming back to the video game. Just enough. I think they find a reason to come back here as opposed to just slamming in a bunch of different reasons as to convoluted reasons as to why they would get back to the game. There actually is a reason to come back to the game, and actually some interesting themes here as well. So it's a few years after Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, when the four high schoolers were sucked into the game, and I like how they've kind of developed since. If you remember from the last film, they kind of started off as like typical, high school stereotypes. You had like Spencer, who was kind of like the meek video game obsessed nerd. You had Fridge, who was the, stereotypical football athlete who didn't really do his homework. You had the preppy girl, who was, let me see if I can find her name here. The preppy girl was Bethany. And then you had Martha, who was kind of like the shy girl. But here, time has passed. They've graduated from high school. They've gone on to college. They've gone into jobs. And it seems like they've kind of more or less escaped those stereotypes. Now they feel like more well-rounded and kind of interesting and more... I mean, they were likable before, but I feel like they're more likable now because there's an ease to them, where it feels like they're not trying to lay in as thick to those character archetypes. But what's interesting is that everyone seems to be doing well in their life except for Spencer. Spencer, he's working a job that he really doesn't like, and he had a romance with Martha that apparently was broken off, and he's just hesitant to come back home and meet up with his friends. So he decides to stay at home, where his grandfather's staying with him, and his grandfather's played by Danny DeVito. And I gotta admit, Danny DeVito, he puts just the right amount of grump into this role. He doesn't fly off the handle like as the crazy kooky grandpa that you might know from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but he does put on enough of a grumpy grandpa character who has somewhat insightful words to say. He connects with Spencer well. Spencer here is once again played by Alex Wolff, and they connect well because they kind of see that they kind of both see the world as life kind of sucks. Spencer is he feels like nothing is left for him in life. He feels like life has been disappointing. And Danny DeVito is basically just yeah, you know what? Life is just going to get worse from here on out. So, do something crazy. And that something crazy happens to be going back to Jumanji. Because apparently Spencer went back for the game. He kept it. It's a little bit damaged, but he could still boot it up and go back into the game. And now you might be saying, okay, now why would you do that? Jumanji is a dangerous place. You could end up trapped in the game forever, or you could end up dead. Why would you want to do that? And the thing is, well, there's two reasons why. One is because, he's drawn back to it in the same way that, a lot of people will be drawn back to video games. Which is that, when you're drawn back into a video game, you want to have that sense of escapism and that sense of power that you want to feel. So naturally, Spencer wants to feel like he's in control of his life again, so he goes back to Jumanji. And also the second reason is, look, if you had an opportunity to be in Dwayne Johnson's body, wouldn't you take it again, even if you were in an action-adventure? Because let's face it, Dwayne Johnson's pretty unstoppable in this game. He can punch people across the room, punch them up into the air. He has absurd amounts of strength. I can understand that. A lot of people's well, that's stupid. Why would you do that? Well, there's quite a few reasons for it. So his friends decide, well, we got to check in on Spencer. We haven't heard from him. They go to his home. They find the game is still on. They find his cell phone is missing right next to it. They figured he must be back in the game. So we got to go back in. But what's interesting is, since the game is a little bit damaged, some things have been changed up. They changed up just enough of the game. Not a lot, but just enough where it could be more interesting. So once they get into the game, they don't get to choose characters. they're automatically assigned different characters. And so you have so now you have like Fridge, who's in the body of Jack Black as the explorer. You have Martha is now in the body of Martha's pretty much in the same body as Ruby Roundhouse, once again played by Karen Gillan. And and Jack Black's character is Shelley, of course. And but what's interesting is they got Danny DeVito is now in Dwayne Johnson's body, and Danny Glover, who is kind of like an old rival, or kind of an old friend, an ex-friend of Danny DeVito, is brought into the game as well. So Danny DeGlover is now in the body of Kevin Hart. Now here's where the film becomes like, you kind of have to distance yourself a little bit from the impersonations, because the impersonations, they're not that strong. Like, I mean, Dwayne Johnson can't quite do a Danny DeVito. Don't get me wrong. It's funny that he's trying to do this kind of like New Jersey accent. It just doesn't feel like DeVito. Although I've kind of found that, Danny DeVito is not someone who's... He's not the easiest person to do an impersonation of. So I kind of get it. Kevin Hart, I feel, kind of overdoes it a little bit as Danny Glover. I feel like it's weird because you have to distance yourself from the real world versions of these characters, because it feels like they go back to their archetypes, like they put them back on. Like in particular with Bethany. Bethany doesn't go into the game initially, but she eventually comes back in as Jack Black's character. And in real life, she seems like a very down-to-earth woman who kind of like knows what she wants out of life. She's confident. She's not as snooty. But then she gets back into Jumanji and she's like, oh my God, guys, I'm back in Jumanji. It's like, didn't you stop doing this? It feels like, for the cast that's in the game, it feels like they're just kind of going back to doing like these simple character archetypes, and they kind of like conflict a little bit. I mean, the good news is though, if you can separate yourself from that, from the impressions they do, the film actually kind of works. Although I do have to mention the one person who does a great Danny DeVito impersonation is they bring in a new character into the game, played by Awkwafina. She plays a thief, and first she starts out playing Spencer, which is not bad, but then she gets to play like Danny DeVito, and it's spot on. Like I mentioned, like doing Danny DeVito is hard. I think Awkwafina nails it. She's got it down pat. And I don't know, maybe there's just something about her acting that makes that character work. The story here is another standard action adventure. Typical of Jumanji, they've got to stop another warlord from taking another MacGuffin that could result in, catastrophic events for like the rest of the jungle. Same stuff. That being said, for like the standard MacGuffin type plot, I do like some of the action sequences they stage here. There's a fun little chase with ostriches where they get to ride around doom buggies. There's a very elaborate sequence where they have to run across kind of like rotating bridges in the middle of the jungle, which I think is like, that seems very more indicative of a video game. That scene is great, not just because they're being chased by wild animals while this is happening, but also because the characters get to use each one of their abilities in this scene to great effect. It's a very great scene. I do like some of the themes here about, coming to terms with yourself. Like Danny DeVito and Danny Glover both have to, come to terms with their friendship. Spencer has to come to terms with Martha. I like these aspects because while they're in the game, they still bring up these issues and try to address them so that, when they get back into the real world, they'll be a little bit of better people once they come back into the world and not just survive the encounter. The only thing I would say that kind of irks me about that is that it seems like a lot of those plots are kind of resolved right before they get to the big action climax, so that by the time we get to the climax, there's less concern about if these characters will live to resolve these issues, because everything more or less kind of feels resolved by that point in the film. So by the end of the film, we're just kind of watching just like an action climax, just like a standard one. It's not a bad action climax. There's some good fight scenes. There's still a lot of hilarity in it. It just feels like, I don't know, it feels like there could have been like a bigger punch that could have been packed in those last few minutes, had they left some of these themes lingering until they got out of the game. But for what's present, I mean, there are some very funny lines here. The special effects still work their magic of like this fantastical world. A lot of funny lines here. Great acting. Even though, you know, imitations aside, I think a lot of like their acting and delivering some of these funny lines is still pretty spot on. There were plenty of moments where I was very much smirking and laughing along, just a little bit. Not quite as much as Welcome to the Jungle. But I think that's because Welcome to the Jungle was refreshing. Next Level just kind of feels like, you know, a few little things have been changed here. We've added in a few little more elements. I guess it's like a very nice DLC to Jumanji. Pardon the little cliche there. But I think there's just enough here to warrant it. Mainly because like I think the new additions are great here. Awkwafina, Danny DeVito, Danny Glover all bring some great character to this film. That I almost wish there were more of them. We get a lot of Awkwafina, but I really wish there was a lot more of that Danny Glover and Danny DeVito dynamic. Because especially for like the first 10 minutes of the film are not in Jumanji. Like they barely even mention Jumanji. They just spend enough time establishing and setting up these characters to where we get to know and like them enough so that there's a reason to root for them when they get out of the game. It's still got a lot of fun action sequences. It's got a lot of funny dialogue. The cast is still great. Chemistry's all there. There's just enough that's found here. I wish they kind of would have harped on it a little bit more about, you know, the obsession with video games and trying to cope with like the world and trying to mend relationships. I wish there's just a little bit more of that focus there. I don't know, maybe maybe they could have like switched it up a little bit, because I don't think Dwayne Johnson does quite as good a job portraying Danny DeVito. I think maybe a few other characters should have given a shot at that, especially considering there's a moment in this film where they literally get to like mix and match whoever wants to be in which body, where I almost wish it should have, you know, gone through the whole motions just to see, just a sampler to see of like who can do which character the best. And then they could decide on that, because like some of the characters even admit like, oh, you're much better in that body than you are in this one. So yeah, it's a fun film. Is it as great as Welcome to the Jungle? No, I don't think it quite changes up that much, but it's still pretty fun for what it is. It finds just enough new stuff here to touch on that I feel it's worth coming back to. So for Jumanji, The Next Level, 3.5 out of 5 stars.